What's up? Hello, everybody. Hope everybody's having a good Tuesday so far. So, new Serum pack has just come out. It's got a ton of stuff in it. So, I tried really hard to make this one kind of not just presets. Alongside the pack comes several samples. In fact, over 50 samples and over 50 clips, so like MIDI patterns basically. This lead that we were listening to right now, in fact, is one of the presets, but as you can see here, it's kind of preloaded with a bunch of the clips that come with the pack. I think this is really cool because it's not just like, presets. It's not just for those kind of users who don't make their own sounds. Say, for example, you make your own sounds, but you want a selection of MIDI or just extra samples and stuff, then it's a really good pack for that. So just like one example would be, if we were to just make like our own sound here, we could jump in here and kind of just load any of the clips from the pack. So there's a bunch of melodies, a bunch of rhythms, and then some kind of extra stuff, which a bit of both, if you know what I mean. So it's really cool if maybe you are a little bit writer's block or something like that, and you just want to kind of get going. So you can kind of quickly load a MIDI, like add a filter, and kind of just start sound designing from there. Hey Buzzsai, how you doing? Hey MindB, how you doing? So anyway, apart from the clips and that kind of thing, there's a bunch of this sequences. So one of the things we heard when we started the stream was just one of the I think it's this one, Eternium Shard, which is made up of a sound and then a bunch of clips as well. Yeah, it was this one. And so this is cool because we can adjust this to fit into whatever track we're working with. Sounds killer, especially with that reverb. Yeah, man, something I've tried to do a lot with the more plucky sounds is to add in a lot of pan movement in the actual preset itself. It's something that I've kind of realized that if you pan something like before a delay, it kind of sounds a lot more spatial. Whereas if you pan something after the delay, the reverb. What am I saying? If you pan something before the reverb, it sounds a lot more spatial. Whereas if you pan the reverb itself, it kind of sounds like the whole space is being shifted left or right. So if you apply a little bit of pan movement in the actual synth itself, and then apply the reverb afterwards, it kind of gives it a lot more natural kind of space to the sound, if that makes sense. So you'll notice a lot of the sounds here have this kind of auto pan, or actual, like with the clips, like sometimes the velocity will be linked to the pan or something like that. Okay, so what was I saying here? This is cool because we can kind of fit it into whatever key we're working with, just using this transpose setting over here. I don't think I've quite chosen a key. This is just a loop with a kick and some percussions. So we can audition a bunch of different keys and see kind of what suits best here. We don't necessarily have to go with D sharp. We can shift it up to F if we want. I'm feeling this G. I think this kind of more higher note sounds nice at this tempo. Another thing that you can actually do is you can actually just drag clips straight from Serum. So, you know, from the pack, you can actually rip these clips and use them as MIDI and use them outside of Serum. Do you know what I mean? So you're not limited to just using these clips. You can just drag this here. Sometimes it does a weird thing where it's like the bars are not exact, if you know what I mean. I don't know why. Yeah, that ends on the D. It's because there was extra notes saved in here for some reason. But yeah, you can then take this MIDI out of Serum and just load it, send it into a different synth. So those clips aren't limited to just being used inside Serum. They're not actually MIDI clips, but you can drag them out and it exports it as a MIDI clip. Then what we're going to need to do though is turn this off over here, and we can actually just add a transpose over here, and then just set this back to default, set this to 7. There we go. It also means that if we find, like using the sequences and stuff, if we find a clip that we like, we can drag it in here and perhaps change the preset, you know, to one of the other presets in the pack. So I kind of like this one, so I'm unsure if I want to change it now, but we could just cycle through, you know, a bunch of other plucks or a bunch of other leads and see what suits it, you know. Or we could, actually, this is probably going to be easiest, just duplicate it like this. Let's press stop here, and then this one we can open up and choose a different preset here. That's quite nice, just to kind of add little hits of the sound every now and then. Okay, let's check out some of the bass sounds. So there's a couple of presets that are kind of just classic, and then there's a bunch which are using the split technique, which I've showed a couple of times on the channel before, where the velocity is kind of linked to the fundamental subtone. And then there's a couple here called wide, a bunch of variations of a similar technique here, where it's using both like a fundamental split technique with the velocity, but then it's also using an odd even harmonic split technique, which I've showed a few times on the channel before, and then using that to kind of pan upper harmonics left and right a little bit. So I find these work generally with slower, more progressive tempo stuff. When the tempo gets a bit too fast, you kind of don't notice the wideness happening too much. So that's why I gave, like, there's variations, you know what I mean? So there's just the traditional ones as well as the kind of more experimental, wider sounds. It kind of just sounds like wider, you know, the plugin wider on the sound, but it gives you a bit more control over the frequencies. Yeah, let's try a couple of these out. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start with the classic. Or we can just put in notes and kind of see how it goes. What note were we on? G. Okay, so like I said, with a lot of these patches, the velocity is linked. I've got a couple of things that I'm working on in terms of new music. Let's just say, like, I had something kind of almost done, and then I was like, you know what, it's not quite right, so I'm kind of rethinking it, and you know, that endless loop of when something's kind of almost done, and then you rethink the whole thing. Yeah, so I'm kind of stuck in that loop at the moment. But yeah, I've got a lot of new stuff coming out. I can't tell you when, though. Yeah, velocity is linked to the sub. So if we put some notes low and some notes high, what's going to happen is it's going to reduce the sub of just the single note here. And that's really nice because it allows the tail of your kick to kind of fully play out before subs from your bass kind of come in and start to clash and that kind of thing. And then I've also, most of the bass presets have a kind of built-in sidechain, very similarly to LFO tools. So not like traditional sidechain with an input, just sidechain that's kind of linked to a 1/4 pattern. And that just makes it easier to kind of quickly just dial in the sound that you're looking for without having to add in countless plugins, you know. Okay, in this example, it's actually not the greatest because the kick is so short, it kind of finishes on the 16th. But you notice here how these notes, because they don't have the sub in them, they're a lot quieter, but they're still sound just as loud, apart from obviously that slight sidechain that we added. I think this one sounded the best in this example, to be honest. We may have changed the width slightly and the sidechain. What's Synth? This is all Serum 2, and it's all except like obviously the drum sounds, the all the synth sounds and the bass sounds are from the latest Serum 2 pack. Hey, sup Keith Lane, how you doing? Hey, Stereotype, thank you. Appreciate that. For me, it's like I just try to keep it as simple as possible, you know? Nice, clean kick, 909 style clap, you know? No over-processing, nothing like that. Just kind of clean, bit of EQ, and then it's kind of all about the placement, not so much of like the kick and clap itself, but the stuff that accents that. So if we just mute the kick and percussions, just mute the bass as well, you'll notice that there's some other kind of drums that just accent the hits every now and then. You don't notice it too much in like the fuller mix, but it kind of just helps to push the noticeable ones. It kind of just adds a bit of groove to those. So you can kind of just keep it as simple as possible. I mean, if we look at the hi-hat, it's just like on the off, and the clap is just on the 2 and 4, like so simple. And they're just sampler channel with an EQ. So, I mean, I did make the sounds. So like I synthesized the drum sounds, but I then bounce it out, and I'm not going to sit and synthesize a clap from scratch while I'm busy with a project. I find that kind of wastes a little bit too much time and snowballs things a little bit. So I tend to do all of that kind of thing in a separate project, you know. But yeah. I think this kind of aux snare is actually even a little bit loud. Hey, The Cube, how you doing? See you, Buzzsaw. Have a good one. Finding a few of those style sounds my techno sets recently goes well in dark rumble hard stuff. Oh, do you mean these kind of like warpy lead sounds? Legato, warps. Cube, I'm good. I'm good, thanks. Okie doogie. Yeah, I gotta go grab myself another coffee just now. Very shortly. Key, is that an extra service for a Patreon? Oh no, don't give anybody any ideas. Hey, meow. Started making Cytrons with them, with the help of them. Cool, dude. Super stoked to hear that. Oh, that's so sick. I could literally just sit and play with that for hours. I'm gonna go get a coffee refill. Stick with me. I will let this loop. Maybe these parts here. What I actually want to do with this vocal is kind of just create, because there's a lot of randomization happening in that granular, I think I'm going to make a large piece, then render it out and chop the best parts. So I can kind of just leave that for now, I think. More as just like a background piece. Just put that there, maybe put some reverb on there. Cool, I'll be back in 2 minutes. thought I pressed the wrong button for a second. Huh. Yeah, I think let's bounce this. And then we can chop out the best parts. Maybe make some sound effecty type things with it. Hey, that was nice and quick. Feels like render times are improved in Bitwig 6. Or maybe it's just, you know, sometimes it's dependent on the plugin and the preset, so it's very hard to say, but that seemed very quick. What the fuck happened there? Why is, like, everything out of time now? What's going on? What the fuck? What just happened? That was so weird. It's almost as if, like, until I soloed the one track and then unsoloed it, all the other ones just, like, forgot what tempo they were playing, and they were just, like, randomly playing any speed. Hey, Zenline, how you doing? Hey, Isomatic, how you doing? So check out these. There's some of these intro downlifters. What it is basically like just a set of sounds that's kind of designed to be like a complete intro. There's a couple of them, so with like recorded instruments and then with some synths and vocal chants as well. I think that's a bit high frequency. Yeah, like this. Yo, okay, that sounds sick. Sick, dude. HS8s. Nice speakers. Maybe we'll get one variation without the low hits, so with just the sample layer. Turning Serum into a rompler. It's using spectral synthesis, so there's kind of other things. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like a bit better quality than a rompler. But yeah, it's just like I said of the presets, just to kind of speed things up a little bit in terms of the writing process, you know? That is sick. maybe with this one we can kind of accentuate the delay a little bit so it goes a bit longer. Yeah, something happens when you bounce stuff out in the beta, Bitwig 6 beta. Something happens where it kind of just freaks out with the timing. Hey, Gilf, how you doing? Thank you. Appreciate that. I need to get another refill and run to the bathroom real quick. Let me loop this for you folks, and I will be back in 2 minutes. I think we need a couple more like sound effect-y type things. So maybe what we can do now is look at so I think we've gone through like a lot of the presets that are in there. Obviously there's 100, so I'm not going to get through all of them. But what I want to do is I want to talk about some of the samples. And we can maybe make like some sound effecty type things. Let's just see, where should we start? Could be interesting. Oh, who would have thought a mouth harp pitched down sounds like an old school techno donk? There's a steam train slowly transforming into a robot and launching into space. Hey, Side Project. How you doing? We're just having fun here. Yeah, this is going to be a blast from the past. This sound reminds me of Peggle. When you're on a sick spree in Peggle. I'm just going to render this out, and then we're going to make a different one. Whether or not it like fits, it's a pretty cool sound anyway, so let's just Let's just make it. Hey, truth be told, how you doing? I think it actually starts a bit slow. We can edit it a bit so it starts a bit faster. the spectral oscillator in Serum, holy shit, it just takes things to a whole new level. You're going to just like freeze a sample, turn it into a synth. So good. I think we've gone through most of the stuff in the pack. Maybe some of the pads. This one could actually work. Yeah, I think that's where I'm going to leave it for today. Not a full, massive long stream, but I just wanted to get through most of the stuff. Kind of just finish up showing you all the sounds, you know, continue on from the video. So I think that's where I'm going to leave it for today. Also got quite a few things that I still need to get done today. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, you can just jump in the Discord as well, about the pack or whatever. Jump in my Discord and you can find me there, ask any questions, or yeah. I will let this loop once or twice for those who want to stick around and listen to what we created throughout the stream. Otherwise, yeah. Otherwise, thanks for tuning in. And I hope everyone has an awesome rest of the day. I hope this inspired you somewhat. Cheers, folks. Where's the beginning here? Bye-bye. Truth be told, there's also a demo of the pack which contains a couple of the sounds, and that's free. That's also available on my store. So if you do like some of the sounds, you know, you might as well just go grab it. I mean, it's not one of those free things where I grab your email and just spam you. It's like actually free. Anyway, cheers folks.